Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Moore, and I really miss you, and I wanted to let you know that we've been thinking about you and wish that we were in school together, but since we're not, I've decided that we are going to go ahead and pick up where we left off with our read aloud. If you'll remember, we had been reading The Lottery Rose by Irene Hunt, and it was about a little boy named Georgie who had been abused by his mom, Rennie Burgess, and her boyfriend, Steve. And because of that, he had been withdrawn and scared most of his life, and the only place that he had that he felt comfortable was a book about flowers and roses that he had found in his school library. Well, one day Steve beat him bad enough that he was taken away from his mom, and he was put in a school that he lived at far away from where his mom was, a school for boys, and he was able to take the rosebush that he had won at a grocery store lottery, and he decided he needed to plant it at the house across the street from the school, even though he was told that he wasn't allowed to plant it there. So the lady that lived across the street, Mrs. Harper, got really upset by this and tore the plant out of her garden and threw it in the yard, and so Georgie is feeling like he hates Mrs. Harper, just like he hated his mom and Steve. But he does love Mrs. Harper's father, who is Mr. Collier, and Mrs. Harper's little boy. And so that's where we're going to pick up where we left off. Georgie and Robin are spending a lot of time together. Robin is the little boy, and this is Chapter 10. Chapter 10. When Georgie spent time with Robin these days, he had many hours in which to watch old Eddie at work in the garden. Robin could be kept quiet there, happily pounding nail after nail into a piece of wood, and Georgie, taking advantage of such times, paid close attention to every task the old gardener performed. Sometimes he longed to help, but old Eddie was not happy with boys being what he called underfoot, and so Georgie only watched him from a distance. One day, however, Mr. Collier made a suggestion. "Would you like to help in the garden now and then, Georgie? Maybe it would be a good thing for you to learn more about taking care of flowers, since you like them so much." Georgie's face showed his eagerness, but a second later he shook his head. "What about Robin? I couldn't keep an eye on him." "I think that either Amanda or I can keep an eye on Robin more often. You can romp with him once in a while and take him down to the lake. But as I said before, you should be doing other things too." Old Eddie was not greatly pleased at first by the idea of having Georgie for a helper. Georgie heard him growl at Mr. Collier as they talked together. "Ain't Sister Mary Angela supposed to keep them kids corralled on the other side of the street?" he said in a mad voice. Then he shrugged and replied to something Mr. Collier said. "Well then, if Missus wants to turn a kid loose in her garden, I hope she knows what it is she's doing." In less than a week, however, old Eddie and Georgie were working together as if the difference between someone who was almost 8 and someone who was 70 had nothing to do with their respect for one another. Georgie, without thinking about it, began to take up some of old Eddie's movements, shoulders rounded with head leaning forward, a slow, shuffling walk in which the front of each foot was thrust forward into the soil at every step. They didn't talk much, but they soon shared a recognition of what needed to be done and why and when. They drove together into town at intervals, and old Eddie came to depend on Georgie's memory of what materials were needed for the garden's growth. Mrs. Harper worked as usual among her favorite flowers, but she kept at some distance from Georgie, seeming never to notice his presence in the garden. One day, however, she spoke to him, and that was the day old Eddie was angered at the behavior of his young helper. Mrs. Harper was on her way to the tool house after working among the azalea beds. Passing a short distance from old Eddie and Georgie, she stopped to inspect the edging Georgie had done along one of the flagstone paths. She called out cheerfully, "Nice job you've done here, Georgie. Thank you." Georgie didn't so much as mumble a reply. Old Eddie was outraged. "Missus only wanted to give you a polite word of thanks," he told Georgie sharply. "Just a polite thank you for something you'd done to please her. And what did you do? You clammed up and walked away like a loony, that's what you done. If I had the right, I'd give you a good smacking for your insolence." Georgie had nothing to say to old Eddie either. He carefully raked beneath the hedgerow where he was working and filled the big wheelbarrow time after time, hauling the debris off to the barrels back of the tool house. After that, he silently reproached Mrs. Harper by picking up the recently sharpened pruning shears that she had left lying in the grass the evening before, oiling them and hanging them in their proper place on the wall of the tool shed. "Missus is careless, that she is," old Eddie had told Georgie on other occasions. "A body that neglects good tools never makes an A1 gardener." He and Georgie glanced at one another often and shook their heads when they found garden tools that Mrs. Harper had left overnight in the wet grass. But this day old Eddie had no praise for Georgie's care of the neglected tools. He kept a severe silence, and when Georgie announced that he had finished his work for the day, old Eddie didn't even bother to glance at him. Georgie meditated for a long time in the soft shade of a royal poinciana tree before he approached his rosebush. He walked over to sit beside it, heavy-hearted and confused at the war of feelings inside him. For a long while Georgie sat silently, touching its leaves from time to time, but not daring to say anything to his friend. A curious sparrow stopped to look at the new buds just coming out on the bush, and its weight set Georgie's rose swaying over close to him. When the leaves stirred with the swaying, Georgie was almost sure he heard the bush say, "That was a bad thing you done, Georgie." He sat quietly, listening to all the garden sounds around him. He thought the bush was probably thinking of Mrs. Harper, saying to itself that she was a nice lady and very pretty. "I say she's mean and ugly," he said sullenly. "I don't care what you think or what old Eddie thinks either." The thought suddenly came to him that after all, Mrs. Harper was Robin's mother, and that maybe Robin loved her. For a moment, he felt guilty, but that didn't last long. Like a flash, he got mad at himself for feeling that way, and then he got mad at the rosebush, too, and at the world and everybody. Okay, so she's his mother. I hate mothers. You remember the one in Tampa, don't you? Well, I hate her, and I hate Robin's mother, too. He paused as a thought occurred to him. "Only, she's not really Robin's mother," he whispered. "There are some things around here that you don't know about." But the rosebush didn't seem at all interested in what Georgie had to say. Georgie was not to be put down, however. "You remember the mean fairy in the story Robin's grandfather read to me when I first started learning?" he asked. "The one that said, 'I'm mad because you didn't invite me, so now your child will die.' And the other fairy said, 'Now just hold on a minute. She's not either going to die. She'll simply go to sleep for 100 years. You remember the story?" Several roses nodded in the wind, and Georgie knew the bush was listening closely. "Well, I'll tell you something," he said. "She stole Robin when he was a baby, and she said, 'I'm mad, so I'll put a curse on you. You'll never learn to talk more than a few words, and you won't learn to read or nothing.'" He thought he heard the rosebush sigh. It was the way Sister Mary Angela sighed sometimes when she talked to him about forgiving Mrs. Harper. "I suppose you think I'm lying," he muttered. There was no answer. He sat for a long time watching a butterfly trying to make up its mind about something or other as it dashed from one flower to another, circled above a spray of water that had been set to give a bed of tired azaleas a drink, and finally settled on a blade of grass a few inches from Georgie's toes. He watched the slow lift and lowering of the bright wings, smiling to himself. Yesterday I learned Robin to say butterfly when we saw one on our walk. His grandfather couldn't understand him, but I could. I said, "He's saying butterfly." And Mr. Collier told me that I understand Robin better than anybody. He was silent for a while, thinking to himself about his plans for Robin. But finally he had to tell some of them to his friend. "I'm going to keep trying till I can learn Robin to talk better. He can say some words real clear already. After that, I'll learn him to read, the way Mr. Collier learned me." He felt something getting tight in his throat while he was speaking. Finally he said, "I know you don't believe me. You think I can't ever learn Robin to talk, except for maybe a few words. You think I'll never learn him to read at all." He rose and got ready to leave. "Well, you'll see," he said stubbornly, but the tightness still held on in his throat. Usually he stopped to touch one or more of the roses that toppled on the long stems, or to whisper goodbye and assure his friend that he'd be back soon. But today he felt discouraged and low-spirited. "We're supposed to be friends," he thought, "but it sure don't seem that way right now." He walked away without saying a word. Late in the afternoon, Georgie took Robin down to the banyan tree playhouse and on to the lake to feed the ducks. They stopped at the kitchen to ask Rosita for bread, and when they left the yard after fastening the big gate behind them, they waved to Mr. Collier, Georgie lifting Robin's hand and showing him how to wave. When they had thrown the last piece of bread to the ducks, Georgie persuaded Robin to sit beside him in the playhouse. He would have liked to read aloud to the little boy, but Robin would not sit still and listen to reading, and so Georgie tried, without very much hope, another method of teaching him. "See, I'm writing our names here," he said, taking paper and crayon from a niche between two of the tree's many trunks, where he had left them from one lesson to another. He printed their names in large, straggly letters and tried to get Robin's attention. "Now, here are our names, Robin," he said, feeling almost sure of failure with his plan, but stubbornly refusing to give up. "This one is yours. When I point here, say your name. Say Robin." Robin had been sitting quietly as Georgie printed their names. Now suddenly he broke into boisterous laughter, snatching the paper, crumpling and throwing it as far as he could. He pulled Georgie's hair and scratched his forehead. Then, just as suddenly, he returned to his quiet gentleness. Georgie bent to look into the clouded eyes. "What's the matter with you, Robin? Don't you want me to learn you to read? Don't you know that I was dumb once, when I lived in another place, and now I read so many books that Sister is surprised?" He took Robin's hand and held it to his cheek. "I don't want kids to call you dumb, Robin." They sat for a long time after that, looking out at the lake, which had begun to reflect the colors of sunset. There was a look of shadowy coolness on the surface that made Georgie long to throw his shirt aside and feel the water closing around his body now that there was no one except Robin to see the welts on his back. It wasn't possible, though. He had promised Mr. Collier that he'd never go into the lake alone and never would leave Robin by himself. "But if we had a boat, Robin," he dreamed aloud, "a nice, flat old boat all our own, then we could go out there together. We could float around all afternoon, and at night we could lay flat in it and look up at the stars. And the good old boat would rock us back and forth, back and forth." He made a rocking motion with his hand, and Robin took it up, swaying his body from side to side in the motion Georgie's hand had made. "You understand that, didn't you, Robin? You knowed what I meant when I said back and forth just as well as anyone." He was pleased at any sign of understanding on Robin's part. Mr. Collier had said, "We mustn't expect too much, Georgie. We must be glad of any strides Robin is able to make, no matter how small they are." After a while, however, he grew uneasy as Robin's rocking motion continued, and he frowned as he watched the child who seemed to have forgotten that Georgie sat beside him. "That's enough," he said. "That's enough to show me that you understand." Finally, he spoke with unaccustomed sharpness. "Stop it, Robin." And with that, the rocking motion stopped, and Robin looked up at him, seeming to wonder at his tone. A few minutes later, he heard the sound of old Eddie's truck coming down the road, which led from the north end of the garden. Georgie watched its approach, and the uncomfortable feeling he had known since old Eddie's angry words in the garden returned, to make him feel worried and uncertain. He felt the loss of a friendship that had comforted him for many months. "Me and you are artists, Georgie," old Eddie had told him once. "Missus pointed that out to me a long time ago. We give the bushes fair, neat shapes. We bring out the best in a passel of flowers with the right fertilizer and the right amount of water. We scotch the weeds and kill the insects that are hurtful. So ain't she right? Ain't me and you artists, same as if we held brushes in our hands?" Georgie had liked that, except that he chose not to remember that the idea came from Mrs. Harper. It was pleasant, though, to think that his work in the garden was something like an artist's work, just as his book work with Mr. Collier was something like a writer's work. When the truck was within a short distance of the banyan tree, Georgie raised his hand timidly in greeting. He was half afraid old Eddie would ignore him as he had done earlier, half afraid that he might stop and continue with the earlier scolding. But the old man waved, seeming friendly enough, and stopping his truck on the shoulder of the road, he climbed down from the driver's seat, grimacing at some pain in his legs. He walked up to the playhouse and leaned against one of the tree trunks. "Thought I'd best stop and tell you I'm not mad," he said, looking over Georgie's head at the woods beyond. Georgie ducked his head in the gesture he had almost given up lately. Sister Mary Angela didn't believe that a ducked head was an acceptable substitute for a polite word. But at that moment, Georgie could think of no polite word. Old Eddie struck a match and held it to the bowl of his pipe, sucking noisily at the stem. "I oughtn't to said I'd like to smack you, Georgie. Missus and me done some talkin' after you left this afternoon. And now I realize that you've been smacked too much already in your life. Still and all, you was hateful to her, and she's had too much grief in her life, like you've had too much smackin' in yours." Georgie thought of the things he had heard from Sister Mary Angela about Mrs. Harper's grief. "Her boy got killed, didn't he?" Georgie asked, knowing it well, but wanting to hear more about it from old Eddie. "Her little boy and her man," old Eddie answered soberly, and Georgie felt a great curiosity to hear what old Eddie might tell him about Robin's brother. "Did you like Paul?" he asked after a while. Everybody liked Paul. He was bright and lively, about your age, I'd say, maybe a little older. Missus used to come down here to this very spot with him, and they'd read together. Sometimes we'd hear him up in the garden, laughing over some story they both liked. Missus doted on that boy, it's the truth." Georgie felt a deep, aching jealousy growing inside him, because Mrs. Harper had come down to the playhouse to read with Paul, because she would never, never come down here to read with Georgie. He felt guilty, too, because he was jealous of this boy Mrs. Harper had loved, this Paul, who had had everything, but was now dead. Then a new thought occurred to him. "She liked Paul better than Robin, didn't she?" he asked. Old Eddie thought for a minute before he answered. "There's different feelin's mixed up in loving kids," he said finally. "Bein' proud of a child they know is a-goin' to shine in the world, and havin' folks say, 'That there fine young fellow's your boy, ain't he?' Well, that's one kind of love. but knowin' pity and at the same time holdin' up for the one that ain't ever gonna shine, lookin' straight at the world and sayin', this here's my boy too. That's another kind of love. Maybe it's more unselfish to be proud of the second one. I don't rightly know. A blue heron waded majestically up toward the shore of the lake and stood some distance away, staring at the three figures near the shore. Georgie and old Eddie watched it absently. Robin clapped his hand once and then resumed his look of quiet dreaming. After a while, old Eddie turned to go back to his truck. Well, you coming over tomorrow, same as usual, Georgie? Me and you ought to finish trimming that hedge before we go on with the mowing, he said. Georgie waved as old Eddie drove away. Then he led Robin toward the house. He was glad when Mr. Collier came down to the gate and lifted the child in his arms. You have a tired boy with you this evening, haven't you, Georgie? Georgie nodded. He was conscious that Mrs. Harper was watching him from the patio, but he made no sign of recognition, hurrying away instead and taking a path far to the west of the house on his way back to the school. When he came to the rosebush, he stopped for a minute, touching the clustered leaves and stroking a half-open bud that looked at him sleepily in the deepening twilight. He felt an air of reproach in his friend, and he longed to set things straight. Don't be mad, he said finally. We've got to be good to each other, the way we always was before. Maybe someday. I thought when old Eddie talked about her that maybe someday. He left the sentence hanging, not knowing exactly what it was he wanted to say.